When, in the days around June 6, 2024, the commemorations for the 80th anniversary of the Allied invasion in Normandy take place, journalists and historians will once again outdo themselves in documenting every movement of the Allied attack in their reports, just as 3 generations of historians and journalists have done before them. I also have 2 videos, Atlantic Wall and the End of the Nomadic Front. But who knows what went on behind the scenes in Germany in the months before the landings, and how the 2 protagonists responsible for defending against the invasion actually acted. The 69-year-old Commander-in-Chief West, or Oberbefehlshaber West for short, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, and the 53-year-old commander of Army Group B, Field Marshal Manfred Rommel. And far away from the action, Adolf Hitler, who repeatedly interfered with the plans. The picture shows him on the day of the invasion, around noon, giving a briefing at the Berghof. If we go back to the months before the invasion, it was by no means certain that the Allied landing would not end in military disaster for the 157,000 soldiers involved. In case of an emergency, the U.S. general responsible for planning an invasion, Dwight D. Eisenhower, had prepared a speech on the eve of the invasion. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the Air Force, and the Navy have done everything in terms of bravery and duty that was possible for them. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Eisenhower, who had to show consideration time and again during the planning, especially towards British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, had assumed that although the German nomadic units would fight hard, the Allies would still be able to break out of their bridgehead. However, then they would encounter the main German resistance along the Seine. Only when this line could be broken would the real battle for Germany begin, which, as he hoped, could be successfully concluded within the same year. However, when he presented his plans to Churchill, the British Prime Minister said that if they had a beachhead stretching from the Seine estuary to Cherbourg and the Brittany Peninsula in winter, with 36 divisions ashore, he would consider it a victory. And if they have also captured Le Havre, I will consider it decisive. Eisenhower simply replied, "By Christmas we will be at the Rhine." But to get there, the invasion forces first had to overcome the strongest fortified coastline in history, built over the previous 4 years, known as the Atlantic Wall. But when it came to capturing fortified ports, the landing operation at Bad Jep on the early morning of August 19, 1942, involving around 10,500 Canadian, American, British, Polish, and French soldiers, had opened their eyes. Because the attack on the heavily fortified port facility, the so-called Operation Jubilee, carried out mainly by Canadian troops and planned by Louis Mountbatten, who was born as Prince Louis of Battenberg and known as Louis Mountbatten since 1917, was shot to pieces by the local 302nd Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Conrad Haase, which was deployed in the Dieppe sector. By the time the order to retreat was given in the afternoon, the losses had already reached 4,359 men. 1,179 had been killed, 2,460 wounded, and 2,190 taken prisoner. However, the Allies had learned from the debacle that was due to the vain and overzealous Mountbatten. Instead of focusing on capturing heavily defended ports, they built artificial ports, known as Mulberry ports, for landing and supply purposes. Special amphibious tanks had also been developed, as well as mine-clearing tanks known as threshing flails, and a tactical air force for ground support. The Wehrmacht had also made considerable efforts to improve its defenses on the coast, but had overestimated Operation Jubilee and its defensive success and drawn the wrong conclusions. Because the so-called Atlantic Wall, which propaganda constantly described as an insurmountable obstacle, was in reality only more or less completed in the section between Le Havre and Antwerp by the end of 1943. However, the fortifications of the Atlantic Wall would have progressed more consistently if the Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, had had more confidence in bunker installations. But von Rundstedt, who was born on December 12, 1875 in Oschersleben, Saxony, had, as commander of Army Group A in May 1940, broken through the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, and then advanced all the way to Dunkirk on the Channel coast. At that time, he had experienced the French dilemma of how dangerous it is to keep the bulk of the division in rigid fortifications and then have too few when enemy breakthroughs or encirclements occur. Now that Rundstedt's mission was to hold a defensive position, he wanted to avoid at all costs the mistake that had proved so disastrous for France, and commented on this to a journalist in early 1944 with the words, "We Germans will not fall prey to the tired spirit of Maginot." But as a trained soldier, he also knew that it would be impossible to defend around 1,150 kilometers of Atlantic coastline and, from Cerbère to Menton, 500 kilometers of Mediterranean coastline. In agreement with the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, von Rundstedt also doubted that the Allies' great strategic mobility could be countered with a rigid defense system, such as the Atlantic Wall, and therefore took the view that a landing could not be prevented. His plan was therefore, firstly, to defend the most vulnerable sections of the coast, with their port cities at the Pas de Calais, the Somme and the Seine estuary, Cherbourg and Brest, and secondly to weaken the Allied forces by delaying them in an attack on the heavily fortified larger ports and then massively destroying the port facilities. At that time, the expansion of an Allied bridgehead was to be delayed until the focus of the landing was clear, and German counterattacks would drive the enemy, who were under constant artillery and air force fire, back into the sea. However, this was only possible with sufficient reserves of tank and armored infantry divisions, which had to be protected by sufficient Luftwaffe fighter groups on their march to the front. But even in January 1944, von Rundstedt had only 50 divisions available for the overall defense, of which 26 were deployed on the Atlantic Wall on Hitler's direct orders. Of the remaining large units, a dozen were either newly formed or still in training, or were burnt-out units transferred from the Eastern Front to the West. Rundstedt repeatedly requested military reinforcements from Hitler in the winter of 1943 to 1944, but these were rejected. The reason for this was both the Allied landing at Anzio, Operation Husky, which took place from July 10th to August 17th, 1943, and the situation in the East, which was worsening every week. However, Hitler was also fully aware that the Allied invasion would come. But after successfully holding back the Allies in Italy at the Gustav Line, shown in red, and not thinking much of the Allies' fighting power anyway, he had come to believe that the German forces in the West could repel any Allied attack. His optimism was fueled on the one hand by the incorrect enemy assessment by the Foreign Army's West Intelligence Division of the Army General Staff, and on the other hand by the completely wrong evaluation of the significance of the defensive success against the attack on Dieppe. Because, contrary to Goebbels' propaganda, that had not been a failed invasion attempt. Now, these propaganda reports of the failed Allied invasion attempt may well have been necessary to boost German morale, which had been shaken by the mounting defeats in the East. However, from a serious military perspective, they were baseless. A particular accusation is directed at the Chief of Staff at the time of the Dieppe operation, of the Army Group D led by von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, Major General Kurt Seitzler. Despite knowing better, he had reported a completely distorted assessment of the Allied Dieppe operation to Berlin. The documents that had been captured and evaluated by the intelligence services clearly proved that Dieppe had only been a so-called violent reconnaissance mission, or, as was also suspected at the Führer's headquarters, an operation intended to unsettle the Soviet ally Stalin, who had been calling ever more loudly for a second front to be opened against Germany. But in the Wehrmacht command responsible for the Western theater of war, the content of Seitzler's report of the alleged invasion attempt had become the accepted view. For Seitzler, this false report had the pleasant effect that on the 24th of September, 1942, following the dismissal of the Chief of the General Staff of the Army, Colonel General Franz Halder, he was promoted to General of the Infantry and became his successor, thus now responsible for operations in the East. Now the agile general stubbornly stuck to his assessment of the Dieppe operation, which indirectly downplayed the danger posed by an Allied invasion, but also suited Hitler's reluctance to confront the next possible problem. To make matters worse, the power-hungry Reichsführer, SS Heinrich Himmler, had now decided to bring all intelligence services under his control, which he succeeded in doing in mid-February 1944 with the dismissal of the head of military intelligence, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, accompanied by the merger of military intelligence and the Reichsführer SS's security service. This had indeed increased the tensions between the Wehrmacht and the party, but it had happened with Hitler's backing, since by then he no longer trusted the intelligence reports. In fact, the military intelligence service in the Wehrmacht's high command, where a resistance circle had formed since 1938, had repeatedly failed to gather intelligence. For example, it had neither predicted the Allied landing in North Africa in November, 1942, nor the one in Sicily in July, 1943. In addition, in April 1943, British intelligence had succeeded in fooling a supposed English officer of the Abwehr with a dead man carrying false plans in his briefcase, claiming that the Allied attack was not aimed at Sicily, but at Sardinia and the Peloponnese. When Hitler became dependent on more reliable and subjectively unbiased information in the following months, SS Chief Himmler seized the opportunity and repeatedly cast doubt on the Abwehr's reports to Hitler. For each allegedly false military intelligence report, he presented Hitler with a pre-edited version fabricated by the SS Reichsführer's Foreign Service Security Service. And since the security service of the Reichsführer SS knew that Hitler wanted his own assessment of the situation, confirmed in intelligence reports, even if it did not correspond to the facts, the security service of the Reichsführer SS persistently painted the situation in the West in the most optimistic colors, accompanied by false representations of the strength of the Allies and their preparations. In order to dampen this artificially created optimism, at the end of 1943, the deputy head of the Foreign Army's West Department, Lieutenant Colonel Droger Michel, marked about 30 fictitious Anglo-American divisions on the enemy camp map of England. Internally, the head of Foreign Armies West, Colonel in the General Staff Alexis Freier von Röhne, a victim of the July 20, 1944 complex, explained it as follows. Since the security service of the Reichsführer SS, as a matter of principle, always reduces each of our strength estimates, the numbers in the final security service of the Reichsführer SS report come closest to the truth. However, although these exaggerations had indeed led to a more realistic assessment of the situation in the spring of 1944, the problem now was that this division could not simply be erased from the map with an eraser. It is well known that these 30 or so fictitious divisions continued to cause confusion in the German High Command for months after the Normandy landings. When Field Marshal von Rundstedt requested reinforcements in the winter of 1943 instead of sending new divisions, Hitler sent him one of the Wehrmacht's most prominent generals in November. The Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He had previously been in northern Italy, where he was supposed to build up a strategic reserve as Commander-in-Chief of Army Group B. Now, in the west, his initial task was simply to inspect the fortifications from Denmark to the Spanish border. However, after seeing what he saw, Rommel recommended a radical change to Rundstedt's plans to Hitler, and was subsequently given overall command of the two armies in what was probably the most vulnerable section of coastline, from the Dutch IJsselmeer to the Loire. However, overall command of the West remained with von Rundstedt, whose forces were now divided into two army groups. Army Group B under Field. Marshal Rommel included the 88th Corps in Holland under General of Infantry Hans Wolfgang Reinhardt, and the 15th Army from Antwerp to the Orne under Colonel General Hans von Salmuth, as well as the 7th Army from the Orne to the Loire under Colonel General Friedrich Dollmann. Army Group G was under Colonel General Johannes Blaskowitz, with the 1st Army on the Bay of Biscay coast until April 30, 1944 under Blaskowitz, and then under General of Panzer Troops Joachim Lemelsen, and on the Mediterranean coast, the 19th Army under General of Infantry Georg von Sodenstern. With Hitler's decision, the main responsibility for repelling the invasion had now been placed in the hands of the considerably younger Rommel, who initially enjoyed relative independence under the otherwise very meddlesome Hitler. However, while Rommel's appointment was a clear snub to the older von Rundstedt, the 69-year-old field marshal considered retaining his position more important than his authority. For the old warrior knew full well that even field marshals, even under Hitler's sole military rule, had little say once a battle began. After the war, he had said that as a senior officer, his only privilege was to inspect the changing of the guard outside his door. This realization must have been frustrating for him, given that he was the one who had achieved the most impressive victories in the first 2 years of the war. In 1939, Rundstedt's Army Group South, which consisted of 886,000 men, played a decisive role in the swift victory over Poland. A year later, during the French campaign, his Army Group A broke through to the Channel within 2 weeks. In 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, beginning June 22nd, the advance passed through Ukraine to Crimea and reached Rostov-on-Don. However, when he then, in the face of a strong Russian counterattack against his southern wing at the end of November 1941, during the so-called Winter Crisis, had described a tactical withdrawal of units as unavoidable to Hitler, Hitler categorically prohibited any movement backwards, whereupon Rundstedt requested retirement and was replaced by Field Marshal von Reichenau on the 1st of December. However, due to strong Soviet pressure, he was forced to implement the measures recommended by Rundstedt a little later. But Rundstedt's opposition to Hitler had enhanced his prestige and earned him a reputation for inner independence and moral courage, especially since only a few weeks later he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front, whose 302nd Infantry Division, as already mentioned, had liquidated the British-Canadian Commando Operation Bad Jep. But now, in 1944, Rundstedt was nothing more than a figurehead in France, which was also Hitler's deliberate assessment. But now, in 1944, Rundstedt was nothing more than a figurehead in France, which was also Hitler's deliberate assessment. He had not been involved in the defeats on the Eastern Front due to his quasi-resignation in November 1941. His reputation still lived on, even though he had virtually condescended to revoke his resignation and take over the Western High Command. Realistically speaking, however, he had also relinquished his authority to Hitler, who had been in charge of everything since December 1941. But Rundstedt's strength lay in the fact that his mere presence in the High Command presumably meant that he approved of its policies, with which the field marshal actually agreed only in a few respects. Nevertheless, Rundstedt continued to be regarded in the army as a representative of sound military thinking and soldierly integrity. However, if we now take an objective look at all the available facts, we arrive at the following conclusion. By 1944, Rundstedt had passed his prime. His mental energy had long since been lost. In short, he had grown old, sluggish, and worn out. Added to this was a strong dependence on alcohol, without which he could no longer sleep. It was therefore understandable that for the past 18 months, he preferred to reside comfortably in his elegant headquarters at Château Saint-Germain-en-Laye, about 20 kilometers west of Paris, and had left the work to his energetic chief of staff, Lieutenant General Günther Blumentritt. Now, at almost 70 years of age, von Rundstedt had developed into a personality of strict and impressive dignity, outwardly cold and reserved, yet hardly ever ruffled. But this was in stark contrast to the daring and temperamental Württemberger Rommel. When Rundstedt tackled a military problem, he followed a fixed, clear course of action. However, he also tended to judge a situation as typical without examining its specific characteristics, and then apply tried and tested textbook solutions. This approach, combined with his experience and accuracy, had usually led to success when he was still in full possession of his mental faculties. But this unyielding determination, an important part of Prussian general staff training, is also known to cause a certain rigidity of thinking and, as in Rundstedt's case, a lack of imagination. This led to a phenomenon that was evident in many German military commanders in both world wars. He perceived problems in a conventional and immediate way, but at the same time assumed that the enemy would behave in the same way. Here's an example. When Rundstedt, who was designated commander-in-chief in 1940 in the event of an invasion of Great Britain, drew up the plan for the landing known as Operation Sea Lion, the weakness of both the German Air Force and the Navy forced him to limit his preparations to a frontal attack across the narrowest stretch of the Channel. 3 years later, he reversed his earlier thinking and concluded that the Allied landing attack would also take place across the narrow Strait of Dover. As for Field Marshal Rommel, who was born on November 15, 1891 in Heidenheim under Brenz, Württemberg, unlike Rundstedt, he expected that the Allies would land in the area of the mouth of the Somme in order to take the important port of Le Havre from the land side. But while this disagreement with Rundstedt, who had seen the Pas-de-Calais as the main focus, was only hypothetical for the time being, Rommel's imagination, which often ran counter to conventional thinking, had often led him to contradict his fellow generals, including Rundstedt. The fact was that most of the generals had always been skeptical of Rommel's abilities, and sometimes even jealous of his prominence, which was cultivated both by himself and by propaganda minister Goebbels. For most of his comrades, Rommel was a political general, a military upstart, and an ambitious self-promoter who had risen from colonel to field marshal in just 3 years, solely because he was on good terms with the party. But they were wrong about that. Admittedly, Rommel may not have been a great strategist, but he had original and mostly practical ideas, possessed a strong instinct for leadership, and had the unusual ability to immediately take advantage of tactical situations and to get his troops out of the most dangerous situations, which his own overzealousness sometimes got them into. This made him the preferred type of commander for Hitler, who often acted more on instinct than on reflection. And although this similarity between the two had often been ridiculed and criticized by the general staff officers, it had made both of them successful in the early years of the war. Now, in 1944 in France, Rommel had decided to fundamentally question all previous considerations regarding the defense against the invasion. In his opinion, it would not be enough to simply turn the ports into fortresses. If the invasion could be repelled at all, it could only be done directly on the beach. He had therefore ordered the coastline to be reinforced with all kinds of obstacles and the bunkers, artillery, and infantry positions on the Atlantic Wall to be expanded so that they could withstand the strongest attacks. On the 22nd of April 1944, he had virtually hammered into his army commanders in a written instruction that the attacker must be destroyed before he reached the country. We must stop him in the water, but not just slow him down. We must destroy all his equipment while it is still floating. The high water mark must be the main line of battle. And since this in turn was in line with Hitler's rigid battle doctrine of not giving up a single meter of ground voluntarily, Rommel was authorized to change Rundstedt's plans so that the fortification of the beach and parts of the hinterland could now also begin. Rommel's plan at the start of the invasion was to use heavy coastal batteries, which were immune to air attacks, to combat the enemy fleet off the coast and the landing craft approaching the beach. Shortly before reaching the beach, these would be taken out by machine gun and anti-tank fire from concrete bunkers, as well as by artillery and rocket launchers in the rear combat zone. The few landing craft that survive the defensive fire are destroyed by minefields laid on the beach. Further minefields and massive barbed wire entanglements along the coastline and flamethrowers fed by oil pipes in the dunes delay the enemy's advance and cause further losses. Gaps in the German defensive line are blocked by concrete structures. Other passages on the beach are blocked by minefields and anti-tank ditches, so that enemy tanks and transport vehicles can be held up on the narrow strip of beach and then engaged, as happened during Operation Jubilee in Dieppe. To optimally man the fortified defensive line within sight of the waterline, Rommel was willing to sacrifice the depth usually required for defending territory. To achieve this, he moved motorized infantry units, which Rundstedt had kept in reserve, to the coast, and narrowed the sectors of the coastal divisions. He had also ordered the forward units, including their supply units and administrative staff, to prepare positions directly on the beach or in its immediate vicinity. Finally, the panzer divisions were to be positioned immediately behind the narrow coastal strip, so that they could open fire on the beach without delay. It is more important to have a panzer division in the attack sector on D-Day than to have 3 panzer divisions on the 3rd day after D-Day. But no sooner had Rommel laid this imaginative plan on the table, which was so different from those practiced so far, than lively criticism came from all sides. Particularly vocal was General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzer Group West and thus head of all armored units. He was downright appalled by Rommel's proposal, since that would mean throwing everything away right from the start. In response, Rommel tried to make Geyer understand that the defense against the expected invasion was not something you could find in a textbook. And the usual objections in favor of a defense from the rear would not apply either, since the Allies would first have to land everything before they could advance further inland. Therefore, it was not necessary to keep strong reserves far in the rear, since they could not be brought to the landing site in time anyway, as they could only march at night due to the enemy's strong air superiority. Rommel was dominated by the idea of opposing the still unconsolidated invasion forces with as much concentrated defensive power as possible from day one. His guiding principle was that the first 24 hours would be decisive. However, after Geiger and Rommel failed to reach agreement on this issue, the latter first demanded a decision from the indecisive Rundstedt, then from Hitler. He then came up with a completely illogical compromise, whereby command of the tank units was divided, with the result that there was now neither a strong tactical nor a strong operational reserve. As was to be expected, neither Geiger nor Rommel were happy with this solution, which led to both of them repeatedly trying to assert their point of view until the day of the invasion on June 6th. In the spring of 1944, the Atlantic Wall lived up to its name for the first time. Before that, apart from the expansion of the ports, the whole affair had been carried out without any real plan and also rather half-heartedly. The reason for this was that von Rundstedt's view that the landing could not be prevented anyway had filtered down to the often second-rate units, which had been partially filled with foreign soldiers ranging from former Soviet soldiers to Indians. As a result, they also had little confidence in their defensive positions and felt little desire to improve them. But when Rommel took over, supervising the expansion almost daily and cheering on the soldiers, his enthusiasm spread to the troops. By temperament, he was more of an improviser, prone to making rash decisions in battle. But Rommel's accurate and apt assessment of the Allies' landing techniques and the countermeasures he ordered clearly demonstrated his ability to plan and organize, which was not even recognized by his fellow generals. In contrast, Allied officers had certainly recognized Rommel's talent. It was fortunate for us that he did not arrive in France 6 months earlier, and that his plans had neither met with the full approval of his superiors nor been carried out consistently by his subordinates. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the pressure from the Soviet armies had increased even more. In order to be able to stop the Red Army, and even then, only if the thaw and the resulting mud did not set in too early, there were only 2 options proposed by General von Manstein and General Zeitzler. Either the deployment of 20 to 25 new divisions to the Eastern Front, or an orderly retreat along a line between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, the so-called bottleneck. Hitler, however, rejected the assessment of the 2 generals and preferred to trust in a thaw, which did not materialize. As a result, the Red Army rolled westward almost unstoppably, driving the Wehrmacht divisions south of the Pripyat marshes to the Polish border and even threatening the access routes to the Romanian oil fields. This forced the severely weakened German forces to defend a longer front than the line from Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, to Rostov, which they had been unable to hold 8 months earlier. Now the Wehrmacht High Command scraped together a dozen divisions in the Balkans, Scandinavia, and Germany, but did not withdraw any from the West or Italy, where all reserves were engaged in combat as a result of the aforementioned Allied landings at Anzio. And while one defeat followed another in Ukraine, Rundstedt continued to receive reinforcements. At the end of March 1944, he had 57 divisions at his disposal. This not easily comprehensible process was commented on April 2, 1944, by British Brigadier General Edgar Trevor Williams, who was then head of the Intelligence Division under British Marshal Montgomery. At the moment, it looks as if the enemy in the East is accepting further and serious disasters in order to secure a good chance in the West. Militarily, this is a strange game, but in the event that the military decision could turn out successfully for us, it makes political sense through the prospect of a compromise peace. In short, one Stalingrad after another in the hope of a single Dunkirk. As the day of Operation Overlord, as the Allies called their operation, drew nearer, the Western Allied intelligence services monitored German troop movements in France more closely. And while Goebbels continued to announce on the radio that the strategic plans did not need to be changed in any significant way because of the Russian advance, in April, 4 of Rundstedt's best divisions had been sent to Poland. The 9th SS Division Hohenstaufen unter Gruppenführer Wilhelm Bittrich, the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg unter Brigadeführer Heinz Hamel, the 349th Infantry Division under General of the Infantry Otto Lasch, which was destroyed in western Ukraine just 2 months later, and the particularly strong Panzerlehr Division under General Oberst Fritz Bayerlein. This considerable shift in forces revealed the full extent of the defeat in the East, and reinforced the Anglo-Americans' belief that Hitler no longer had any strategic reserves and could not spare divisions on any other front. However, this also meant that the Wehrmacht was no longer able to keep one enemy at bay while fighting another, with the result that the various fronts had now become one, and the Allies could each benefit from the other's offensives. After giving up 3 of the 7 panzer divisions, Rundstedt's combat strength was weaker than at any time since mid-1943. However, after the hoped-for thaw finally set in on the Eastern Front and all movements by friend and foe were bogged down in the mud, Rundstedt's units were restored to their former strength of March 1944. Now there were 60 divisions in the West. That was more than before, but still 10 fewer than Rundstedt had demanded as the absolute minimum. However, even if the 2 SS Panzer Divisions 9 and 10 had remained in Poland after the thaw began, at least the overpowered Panzer Training Division had been transferred back to France, along with 4 other tank divisions that had been severely battered on the Eastern Front. The supposedly best of the 4 was the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte under Brigadeführer Theodor Wisch. However, it had been so decimated by previous battles that it first had to be refreshed in Belgium. In reality, however, no real renegotiation took place, as the remnants of the 3 battle-weary divisions were integrated into Rundstedt's 3 tank divisions, which were still in training. This was a very short-sighted move, because it called the entire replacement system into question, but at that point, Hitler's only concern was to somehow get through the next crisis. And as was often the case in the late phase of World War II this time as well, the situation map at the Führer headquarters showed a considerable increase in the formations available to repel the invasion, even though it was merely a collection of tactical symbols for large units, many of which were only a shadow of their former combat strength. But since the Red Army continued to press forward and fighting had flared up again on the Italian front, there was little chance that Rundstedt would receive further reinforcements before midsummer. The closer the date of the invasion drew, the more rigorously Britain tightened its security measures. In addition to drastic restrictions, which even subjected diplomatic mail to censorship, a 200-kilometer stretch of coastline opposite France and on both sides of the Firth of Forth was closed to all visitors in April. And everywhere in the Dover area, there were now countless tanks and aircraft in large storage areas. However, these were all harmless rubber dummies meant to deceive the German intelligence service. When Hitler found out about this at the Berghof, he dismissed the British measures as a bluff, believing that no one would put on such a show if they were planning a decisive operation. But what he thought was a bluff was actually a cleverly orchestrated system of strategic deception by British intelligence, with which they hoped to tie down hundreds of thousands of German soldiers between Le Havre and Antwerp through passive waiting until the battle in Normandy was won. And as could be seen from the beginning of the invasion on June 6th, the British plan had fallen on fertile ground. For both Rundstedt and the Wehrmacht leadership had come to the conclusion that I would in all probability launch the attack against the French Pas de Calais, located at the narrowest point of the Channel, and that Normandy, if anything, was only a diversionary target. Because from Pas de Calais, that would also be the easiest route to the Ruhr region and the Rhine. From these considerations, Pas de Calais became almost an obsession. And once again, the German leadership made the mistake of assuming that its importance for them would be the same for the Allies. And as so often before, the German intelligence officers were unable to make use of the countless pieces of information at their disposal, as the Abwehr officers, assuming no malicious intent, often approached the matter with a formulaic, unimaginative mindset. In addition, the British had stationed a fictitious Fourth Army at Edinburgh Castle, and the Americans had even created an army group led by the prominent General George S. Patton, which existed only on paper, whose fictitious units radioed away at their supposed locations in England, suggesting to the German defenses that the Canadian First Army and the American Third Army would form the spearhead of the attack at the Pas de Calais. And as the Allied intelligence service found almost unbelievably, there was no indication that the Wehrmacht leadership considered an invasion in Normandy between Le Havre and Cherbourg in their deliberations. But then the British discovered through aerial reconnaissance and reports from the French resistance that there was heavy rail traffic between the Seine and the Loire in the first week of May. The Wehrmacht had also regrouped and apparently made Normandy its focal point. Soon after, it was also reported that the 21st Panzer Division, under the morally questionable Major General Edgar Feuchtinger, had been moved from Rennes in Brittany to the Caen-Vire area, near the sector where the British Second Army was supposed to land. And furthermore, that after being transported back from Hungary, the Panzerlehr Division had not returned to its old position around Verdun, but instead to the area around Le Mans, which was only a day's march from Caen. This information was all the more important because no armored divisions had ever been stationed in these areas before. And while up until then the only reserve had been an SS Panzer Division, now Rundstedt had 3 well-equipped Panzer Divisions at his disposal between the Seine and the Loire. This reinforced the Allies' suspicion that the German military leadership had indeed learned of the invasion plans, or at least suspected them. This impression was further reinforced in mid-May, when Major Friedrich August von der Hechte established a blocking position across the Cotentin Peninsula with the newly arrived German paratrooper Regiment 6, exactly where the soldiers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were supposed to be dropped. At the same time, the resistance had reported the transfer of the 5th Parachute Division under Lieutenant General Gustav Wilke to Rennes, and that the 17th SS Panzer Division, Götz von Berlichingen, and Brigadeführer Werner Ostendorf were also about to march into Normandy. After all that, the Allies now wanted to know just one thing. What and how much did Field Marshal von Rundstedt know about their plans? The truth was that these spontaneous troop movements were not carried out on the basis of enemy reports from the Foreign Army's West Defense Department, but rather on Hitler's intuition. I would like to remind you that Rundstedt also assumed that the main attack north of the Seine would be preceded by at least one diversionary attack in order to draw and tie down his fast reserve troops. In fact, at the beginning of the year, Hitler had expected such an operation against the Danish coast. However, he was then uneasy about the possibility of a two-pronged attack on the Biscay and Mediterranean coasts, a concern shared by von Rundstedt. However, when it became apparent in April that the Allied armies in the Mediterranean would concentrate on Italy for the time being, the General Field Marshal decided that the Allied diversionary attack would be carried out on the Breton coast and recommended that the troops south of the Loire be withdrawn, except for a small police force. His reasoning was that the Allies were so intensely engaged on the Italian front that they would not be able to land in southern France in the near future. Therefore, the bulk of German forces in the west should be concentrated on the Channel to show the Allied forces opposite them in southern England that they were well prepared for defense. From a purely military standpoint, that wasn't fundamentally wrong, but Hitler immediately dismissed it. He knew that withdrawing occupation troops from occupied territories would have devastating political repercussions throughout Europe. In addition, just south of Limoges and Lyon, the predominantly communist Maquis, the most dangerous group in the French resistance movement, was the strongest. Exposing this area during such a tense and stormy time would significantly increase the risk of an open revolt breaking out. Another indication for keeping the troops in the south was that in the last week of April, German aerial reconnaissance had detected much larger concentrations of amphibious landing craft west of the island, while those around Dover and Folkestone had not been significantly reinforced. Based on these reports, Adolf Hitler expressed his opinion on May 2nd that the Allies would focus their main effort on the Normandy coast after their landing, and therefore ordered the immediate reinforcement of the section shown in green between the Seine and the Loire. As Rundstedt's chief of staff, General of the Infantry Günther Blumentritt reported after the war, the field marshal had carried out Hitler's order only reluctantly, especially since the commander of the Western Naval Group, Admiral Theodor Kranke, who was on the left in the photo, had assured him that large-scale landings between Caen and Cherbourg were virtually impossible due to the rocks off the coast. And Rundstedt's chief engineer had argued that the flooded area around Carentan would practically rule out a major attack on the peninsula. So, Rundstedt stuck to his original opinion that the first Allied strike would take place between Fécamp and Le Tréport, that is, on both sides of Dieppe, and then the main attack would happen north of the Somme. According to Rundstedt, the gathering of ships in the ports of Devon and Cornwall was part of a deception plan aimed at diverting his attention from the Pas de Calais. As for Rommel, his assumptions fluctuated between those of Hitler and those of Rundstedt. He still expected the main landing at the mouth of the Somme, but had also come to accept the idea of a strong Allied diversionary attack in western Normandy. And true to his nature, he immediately reinforced the fortifications and local troops between Cherbourg and Le Havre, and moved his reserves closer to the coast. He had also requested that the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth, which was under Hitler's strategic reserve, be deployed to the Saint-Lô-Carentan area, in the immediate vicinity of the landing zone of the 4th U.S. Infantry Division and the 2nd Ranger Battalion. But once again, Rundstedt had a different opinion, and this time Hitler did not decide in Rommel's favor. While all this guessing was going on the German side, the Allied air forces carried out heavy air raids every day on key targets in northern France, destroying rail facilities, locomotive sheds, and marshalling yards, and in the process, countless supply trains were destroyed. Due to the increasingly long repair times of up to 2 weeks, Rundstedt's transport officer reported to the Wehrmacht High Command at the beginning of May that the supply situation in France had reached a critical point, as only 60 trains had arrived on average in April instead of the required 100, and now in May only 32. By June 5th, the day before the invasion, the Anglo-American air raids had been massively intensified once again, and now the bombardment was directed against road networks and supply points. The final blow against German supply traffic was dealt by successful attacks on the bridges over the Seine, Our, and Meuse. By June 5th, out of the 24 bridges between Paris and the sea, 18 had been destroyed. 3 had to be closed for repairs, and the remaining 3 were subjected to such heavy air attacks that they could only be used for major movements at night. Then, on June 6, 1944, early in the morning, after intense bombardments of the coastline and the rear area by rocket launchers, heavy naval artillery, and bomber formations, the landing in Normandy began. The events and outcome are well known. As for the 2 protagonists, the very different field marshals Gerd von Rundstedt and Erwin Rommel, their plans had failed for a variety of reasons. In Rommel's case, the animosity directed against him played a significant role. Most of his unorthodox ideas had been rejected by the majority of his comrades, many of them also by Field Marshal von Rundstedt. If Rommel's idea of stationing tank divisions directly behind the coast had been implemented, the Allies would have found it considerably more difficult, if not impossible, to drive the Wehrmacht out of France. Or they might not have landed in Normandy at all. When, on June 5th, Rundstedt's chief meteorologist said that a landing was unlikely for 2 weeks due to the stormy weather in the Channel, high-ranking officers from the Normandy front had left for a war game exercise. This was despite the fact that announcements of the invasion on 6 June had been intercepted by the French resistance on the radio. Rommel had also left France on June 5th to celebrate his wife's 50th birthday in his hometown of Herrlingen on the 6th. He did not return to the front until around 10 o'clock in the evening on the 6th. His superior and rival, Field Marshal Rundstedt, who certainly was not Rommel's friend, as is sometimes written, openly criticized Hitler shortly after the invasion began, and in light of the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allied air forces. When, in a conversation with the High Command, the Wehrmacht Chief Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, he literally demanded, "End the war, you idiots." He was relieved of his position as Commander-in-Chief West on July 2nd, 1944, but was reinstated as Commander-in-Chief West at the beginning of September. In December, he led the Ardennes offensive, which failed in January 1945, and was finally dismissed on March 7th. On May 2nd, Rundstedt, along with his son, was taken prisoner until his release for health reasons in May 1949. He died in Hanover on the 24th of February 1953 at the age of 77. Field Marshal von Rommel did not survive the end of the war. On July 17th, he was seriously wounded in Normandy during a low-flying aircraft attack. After resigning his command of the army group, he had been convalescing at his home in Herrlingen. After he was indirectly linked to the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20th, October 14th, 2 generals sent by Hitler confronted him at his home with the choice of committing suicide or facing the People's Court. Although Hitler's former favorite general was convinced that it must be a plot, he took his own life with a vial of cyanide brought by the generals. Sic transit gloria mundi, thus passes the glory of the world.